Dr. Jennifer, the new word, I just went in. Dr. Jennifer Spindel, all right, and Jen Spindel is a University of New Hampshire professor who specializes in international relations, specifically in great power competition, international arms trade. Obviously, in class, we've been talking about different ways that technology fuses through the international system. All right, so segue. Today we brought in an expert in great power competition, right, to talk about how great powers can't always get what they want. They find sometimes that they can get what they need. You be the judge.
Awesome, great. Well, thank you all for coming out today. I appreciate it. My goal with this presentation is to talk to you a little bit about the work that I've been looking at, really the limits of technological diffusion and some of the unintended consequences of especially great power states when they do things like sell arms, give security assistance, or security systems training and things like that. So I'm going to sort of talk at you for a little while, but please feel free to raise your hand and interrupt. And my hope is, at the end of the presentation that we've got lots of time for questions, for back and forth. So again, this sort of presentation itself is on the sort of peculiarities of great power competition that we often don't talk about, both in policy and scholarly spheres. But my background more generally is on international security, alliance management, and arms transfer. So happy to sort of open up and connect to any of those topics as well. So to sort of jump into this, we usually think that great powers are like parents, right? They can tell their junior partners, their junior partner allies, go do this, right? And the ally has to do it. If they don't, they'll be punished by the major power, right? If you don't contribute whatever percentage of your GDP to the budget, if you don't act as we tell you, we will punish you. We will withhold something that you want, right? So great powers, we think, can usually boss around their junior partner allies. Again, that's because they have things these junior partners want. And it's important to realize that those things that junior partners want can be both material, weapons, money, bases, right? Or it can be things that are less material, more ideational, like reputation, right? A lot of states find it advantageous to be associated with the United States. Right? That's as well as political power. Right, so that's a sort of conventional wisdom, right? That great powers can punish these misbehaving junior partners. And we've seen that happen quite recently. So if you followed the developments with Turkey deciding to go outside of the NATO alliance and purchase the S-400 air defense system from Russia, right? How did the US respond? It punished Turkey, right? It removed it from the F-35 co-production program, even after Turkey had already rolled out its first F-35. And if you ever want evidence of these sort of cult of offensive weapons, go ahead and Google Turkey F-35 rollout ceremony. It is an hour and a half of astounding symbolism, imagery. They wrote a song for the F-35. There was a play, right? So Turkey was committed to getting this F-35. It had a sort of particular place in its national understanding, right, being NATO, being Turkey, and then Turkey misbehaves, and the U.S. says, get out. The U.S. could do this, even though kicking Turkey out of the F-35 program cost the U.S. about $500 million. And as you all know, right, that's chump change in the U.S. Yeah, it's like half of one plan, right? So, yes, there was a cost to the United States, but as a major power that can control its junior allies, the U.S. can do whatever it wants, right? It says, Turkey, you're gone. You acted in a way that was incompatible with being a good NATO ally, therefore we punish you. And that story is one that we tell sort of again and again, right? That major powers can do this, junior powers just kind of have to suck it up and deal with it. We've read Thucydides, right? The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. But what I'm trying to challenge here, and have you think about is, are there limits to major power coercion, right? How can junior partners push back and maybe make things more difficult for their major power partners? What I'm going to propose is that the way that junior powers have openings is because their major power allies care about their reputation. Major powers want to be seen as good, reliable, maybe benevolent sometimes, right? But basically, major powers care about their reputation for being a good And so this means that junior partners who can claim mistreatment, maybe even abandonment, can cause real anxiety for these major powers. And that's because allies watch what others do. And so if, for example, you're Ukraine, you're not a formal ally of the United States, but you're friendly with the US, you're friendly with NATO, you're friendly with the EU, you're saying, come defend me. What's the other state that we've heard about in relation to the invasion of Ukraine? Taiwan, right? Taiwan is taking cues from what the US and the West are doing in Ukraine. If they intervene, Taiwan is reassured, and maybe they'll come to our aid. If not, the question is, will Western powers' reaction toward Ukraine cause anxiety in Taiwan? Basically, being a good ally matters to your other allies, right? A major power does not want to face an alliance crisis of confidence. Because what do allies do when they're uncertain? Sometimes they take up their own arming, so they'll try and start their own defense industry. Sometimes they'll try and seek security guarantees from others. You don't want to have your allies uncertain about what they're going to do. So how does a major partner deal with this? They end up giving more things to the human power. Right? It's kind of like parental bribery. Right? Please don't cry in the toy store, I'll give you a stuffed lion later. Right? It's the same exact logic here. This happens even when the major power doesn't want to do it. So one of the less talked about, unrecognized consequences of being in an alliance and of being a major power is the ways in which you're open to this sort of reverse coercion, right? You don't want your allies to cry foul, so you're going to end up giving them things that you don't really want to. That's a sort of basic idea here. Again, this is all about reputation, right? Major powers want to have a reputation for being an ally. Why? Well, if you're seen as a good, responsible, committed ally, it's going to help with your relations with adversaries. Right? You can say to them, don't screw around with my ally, or else. And they'll be more confident that that or else is a legitimate threat. But being a good ally also helps keep and attract junior partners. You're a good ally, others will look to you for aid and assistance. So major powers find a lot of value in having this reputation for being a good ally. Which means, right, uncertainty is problematic. You don't want your allies going rogue, and you don't want your adversary to make challenges. Your reputation as a state really matters. And importantly, being a good, effective major power is going to take a lot of work and upkeep. Right? You can't just be an ally and expect that things will be hunky-dory, right, without work. Alliances are fundamentally relationships. Just as relationships will fall away if you don't talk regularly engage, the same is true for alliances. Being a good ally is hard and big work. So why do we care, right? Why have a discussion about this, especially, of course, on military engagement technology? Well, one of the reasons is that junior partners have a lot more agency, ability to set the agenda, push back the problems if they want, than we tend to acknowledge, either as scholars or as policymakers. Right? If you look at the way that a lot of people talk about the US-NATO alliance, it's, well, you know, the US can just tell France and Germany to spend 2% of their GDP. Right? Can they really just do it that easily? No, right? These junior partners have a lot more agency than we tend to acknowledge. Right? In some ways, they're kind of Calvin and Hobbes. Right? They have their own sort of inner lives that we only get glimpses at. They're sometimes chaotic. If you're a Calvin and Hobbes fan, right, sometimes your allies are playing Calvin ball, this made-up game with rules that are constantly changing and no one actually knows. So major powers cannot just do as they please. As future military leaders, as people interested in policy, right, it's really important to be aware of the ways in which junior partners can coerce their major power partners. That's a sort of abstract theory, right? Reputation matters, major powers care. Because of that, junior partners can push back of things that are major powers number one. We try and make that a little more concrete for you by talking through a case study. We talked briefly about the U.S. relationship with Taiwan. We're going to go back to the Cold War, and then we'll sort of fast forward to today. This is going to be a necessarily very quick overview of U.S.-Taiwan relations. If you have questions, please do feel free to interrupt. I'm sorry, I didn't even break it here. So in the 1970s, the United States was allied with Taiwan, but wanted to pursue diplomatic relations with mainland China. At the time, there was a bright line between the two. You could either talk to Taiwan, or you could talk to mainland China, but you couldn't do both, right? Taiwan insisted that it was the true and only Chinese representative, and then China insisted that it was the true and only Chinese representative, and that Taiwan was part of one China. So the United States was interested in growing relations with mainland China, but was formally, right, mutual defense treaty, allied with Taiwan. Now, if we think about great power distribution, who's the biggest power, who has the most things to offer here? The United States. So the United States should have been able to cut ties from Taiwan. To say, you know what, this is no longer working with us, we're going to go switch to mainland China. In theory, that should have been possible. What actually happened is that the U.S. ended up in a decades-long arms strength relationship because Taiwan successfully played to U.S. reputational concern. Right, so here we're seeing real concrete side effects where a junior partner is able to make these reputational claims and get things that the U.S. didn't want to give it. Right, just to refresh all of our geography, right? Taiwan, China, right? During the Cold War, lots of interest in sort of who's controlling the South China Sea, right? Japan is up here, sort of hoping that nothing bad happens in the region. And even today, right? Access to the South China Sea is an ongoing issue. So what happens? Taiwan decides to try and forward this narrative that the United States is being a bad ally. And it did this by talking to other allies, by referencing allies that the U.S. cared more about. Which allies does the U.S. care the most about? The European allies, right? So what Taiwan tried to do was cause doubt and uncertainty about the U.S. commitment to those European allies, right? And hopefully have them pressure the U.S. to stay the course with Taiwan, to kind of link chain, right, of things that are happening here. So what does Taiwan do? Well, in October of 1972, Taiwan was laid to the groundwork. This is right after Henry Kissinger made the secret trip to mainland China. Taiwan tells the United States that your actions cannot be reconciled with the requirements of friendship. Right? We're putting you on warning. You're not being good. We're unhappy. Taiwan then starts to escalate this rhetoric. So this is the Taiwanese premier, Chang Ching-kuo, who says, you know, look, there are historical ties between the United States and the Republic of China, Taiwan. And that this friendship between the U.S. and Taiwan is important not just to Taiwan, but to other allies and friends of the United States in the Asian and Pacific region. And so Taiwan is saying, screw with us, you're going to make all these other allies equally, if not more nervous. Right? Really laying out the stakes for the United States. So the big question, will the U.S. come to your aid when you need it? In October of 1975, after presidential visits to mainland China, the vice premier of Taiwan says that European visitors are questioning the willingness of the U.S. to come to their aid. That what the U.S. is doing is going to cause anxieties in Europe. What does the U.S. not want to have happen? European allies will consider it. Right, so this is a really smart play by Taiwan. The U.S. State Department even realized this, and just a month later said that, you know, we don't intend to normalize with mainland China in such a way that we downgrade the integrity of our commitment. So the United States saw its alliances as linked, that what it did with Taiwan would be seen as foreshadowing what it would do in Europe, and that changing that relationship with Taiwan could cause real anxieties among the European allies. It might not be a rational fear, right, but it's one that existed at the time and actually affected what the United States did. Anyone know who that guy is? Kissinger, yeah, right? Henry Kissinger, who is a fantastic resource for wonderful quotes about why the U.S. is doing what it's doing. Henry Kissinger says basically, we cannot be seen to be creating a context where any major change in our relationship with Taiwan, which implied abandonment of yet another ally. That Taiwan is claiming it was being abandoned. And as Kissinger said, it's going to cause some problems with us. And it's interesting, right? There's huge power race imagery here. The US, one of the two superpowers in the world. Taiwan, tiny, not that important. And yet, the US does not need Taiwan, but, right? And that but is all about reputational fears. The US cannot be seen to be reversing its policy or abandoning Taiwan because of the effect that this will have on other countries. That's a pretty astounding statement. Right? We do not need Taiwan, but we're stuck with it. And so the US dilemma was this. It needed to formally end its relationship with Taiwan in order to embark on a relationship with China, really take advantage of the Sino-Soviet split, right? Crucial to Cold War geopolitics. But Taiwan was repeatedly, in public and in private, claiming abandonment. That, the US was concerned, would make the European allies nervous. And so what's the US do? It's going to give arms to Taiwan to make it happen. Again, the US could have just said, we're done, right? We're out. You have nothing that could form, right? So it embarks on this accelerated arms transfer program to Taiwan. To make that a little concrete, so one of the first things that the US did in December of 1972, right as Taiwan was starting to increase its narrative of abandonment, the US approved putting an F-5E production line in Taiwan, right? So not only giving Taiwan weapons, but giving Taiwan the knowledge and skills to produce those weapons on its own. Taiwan had been asking for this for a decade. When did it finally get it? After it started trying to coerce the US. In 1975, right, as the US is recognizing Taiwan's reputational claims, the US decided to give it F-104 Starfighters. The Starfighter is my favorite plane because it was not a great plane. Right, so this was not a give us military capabilities, it was a, we would like to show that we are still committed to Taiwan. Each of these arms transfers generated significant backlash from mainland China. The US received telegrams and aircraft at the time, right, not cell phone calls, saying, are you sure that you're giving to mainland China? It sure seems like you're staying with Taiwan. That this prolonged the normalization process. And it wasn't just these two examples. Overall, US arms aid to Taiwan increased from $139 million in 1977 to $209 million in 1980. What happened in 1979? Taiwan Relations Act, which formally severed diplomatic ties with Taiwan, abrogated and basically made disappear the 1955 Mutual Defense Treaty. And yet, the next year, Taiwan gets some $200 million from US arms aid. Even after the US said, we're not really going to do this. This has continued for Taiwan, right? So the sort of story of US-Taiwan relations is that the US is no longer formally allied with Taiwan, but embarking on this relationship with mainland China took way longer than the US thought it would, because Taiwan kept raising these reputational concerns. So what do we know about sort of the US and Taiwan from a junior partner leverage perspective? The US could have kept ties with Taiwan and didn't need Taiwan for anything. But Taiwan was able to stoke these fears of US alliance reputation and credibility. And so, the United States continued to provide arms and it prolonged the normalization process with China. Right, so do allies actually care about their reputation beyond this one example? This is where there's a pretty big disconnect between what scholars do and think, what policymakers do and think. Whether or not states have reputations and care about them is something that's been hotly debated by political scientists. But it's kind of an accepted fact among policymakers, right? That what you do with one country is, of course, going to bear on your relations with others. And that's the whole logic of the domino theory, right? That Eisenhower articulated in 1952. Right, that you have to stand firm in Korea, or else the Soviet Union will invade West Berlin. Right, so policymakers see these commitments, their actions as linked. We've got ample evidence of that before. The question is, what about today? Do we see these phenomena existing today? Well, one of the things that's been in the news fairly frequently is whether or not China is going to invade Taiwan. Right, Taiwan has said, we think this is becoming more likely. And Western and U.S. responses to Russia's invasion of Ukraine are affecting what Taiwan thinks. Right, so again, these things are seen as linked and interdependent, even if it makes no rational or objective sense for them to do. In March of 2022, there was polling done in Taiwan. 40% of people in Taiwan believe that China could annex Taiwan. 33%, so only 1 in 3, were confident that the U.S. would provide military support to Taiwan. And 59% believe that the U.S. would not take part in joint action against China. So yes, the U.S. is no longer formally allied with Taiwan, but the response to Russia and Ukraine is affecting what Taiwanese people think about what might happen if China were to invade. Taiwan, again, is not a formal U.S. ally. The United States formally cut diplomatic ties in 1979 with the Mutual Defense Treaty, which remained to disappear. But the U.S. sometimes provides Taiwan with arms. It's a very sensitive issue and topic between the U.S., China, and Taiwan. About a decade ago, the U.S. had to emergency land a fighter plane in Taiwan. And China said, oh my goodness, you're giving Taiwan arms, this is a huge problem. Right? So anytime something arms related in Taiwan comes up, it causes lots of problems. And so the US has this policy of strategic ambiguity, right? It's this will they, won't they policy. The US has never, revise that statement in a minute, said we will come to Taiwan's defense. President Biden on 60 Minutes about a week ago said, the United States will defend Taiwan. What happened the day after that? The rest of the U.S. government said, no, 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 just kidding. U.S. policy is unchanged. Right, so this is an area where Taiwan is still seen as a U.S. friend. The U.S. is trying to walk this line between being able to defend Taiwan and not anger China. Right, but again, what happens in Taiwan has been in the minds of policymakers connected to what's going on in Ukraine. Right, so the real question that I'll leave us with before we jump to the discussion, right, is should the United States care if Taiwan has questions about the U.S. commitment to Taiwan? What we know is that junior partners can, have, will continue making these reputational claims, that these reputational claims often result in the junior partner getting more, better quality, greater numbers of arms, security assistance. Right? And so should the United States care what Taiwan can claim about the U.S. commitment? Should the U.S. get involved in Ukraine to demonstrate its commitment to the NATO allies? Right? Those are the policy questions that underlie this idea about junior partners being able to coerce their major power partners. So I will leave it there and leave the rest of the time for questions, comments, discussion, argument, whatever you would like to chat about. Yeah.
So what are the recent armed developments in Taiwan? What are
It's a great question. So under President Trump, there was authorization to sell arms to Taiwan. China lodged a formal protest in the United States. So private is sent cables to the State Department, this email goes through this one, right? To the State Department saying, this is you getting involved in an internal matter. We don't appreciate this, please don't do it. And then publicly in China, actually newspaper articles, saying, the US is betraying China and acting politically. So very often that's what happens, that arms sales are authorized, there's a backlash by China, the US says, okay, we'll delay giving the arms to Taiwan, and then at some point in the future, arms will be done to Taiwan. It remains a very, very hot topic, especially in Taiwan relations.
Currently, there are a few Taiwanese American vets here at this point, and I'm not sure about the service academy. I've been told that I represent the diplomatic relation of my country and the U.S.
Yeah.
What do they represent in this state?
That's a great question, and it would depend, I think, on who you ask. China would say that there's no sort of representation here at all, right? This is a thing that we'd rather not acknowledge that this exists. I'm sure from a Taiwanese perspective that this is seen as continued U.S. goodwill and ties to Taiwan, right? Access to U.S. training, whether at the academy level or at sort of specific operational levels, is a sign of alliance and friendship. And so I imagine that the perspective there is quite significant. You have China, you have Taiwan, and then the U.S. would likely take this approach of this means nothing, don't look into it, right? It just is. So it's a very fraught relationship.
Question that is interesting point is off the side of the very long term, but also from the region. Taiwan and we have a long time.
Yeah, so this is what I like to call the grapevine professors or Yelp phenomenon, which is that it doesn't matter how many good reviews you have, one bad review is going to speak a lot louder. And so, if you think about the US-UK relationship, right, the special relationship, they're very close. When does that relationship sort of get the most attention and matter the most? When the UK says, this isn't good, right, you're doing bad. So there are sort of extraordinary moments when this goodness, I think, can outweigh some of the things of mistreatment. So the AUKUS deal to give Australia either US or UK nuclear submarine technology was a huge statement, right? Be only the second time that the US would export this technology, the first being to the UK. So that's a sort of really great statement. But if in 5 years, likely, Australia says, hey, you guys signed this deal and never gave us a nuclear submarine, right? That's going to then outweigh any sort of positive statement. So it means that junior partners are really in a sort of privileged position here, right? You can have a track record of 20, 25 years of good relations, but the minute a junior partner says, 2-star review, right? That's going to speak a lot louder than the history of good development. So major powers are kind of screwed in a lot of ways. You have to be very good, always maintaining this relationship, and one slip up, and you can be facing a cascade of problems. Yeah.
Speaking of subs in Australia, how do you account for competitive dynamics within alliances for foreign military sales? So, and this is not just an anecdote about the French, it is about the French, but the anecdote is not just submarines in Australia and various deployments, and many of us in here may have our own instances of this, but the French are good partners. Acknowledging this is the conversation in general. In my experience, the French are good partners in a multilateral or a NATO construct when it provides them an advantageous vector for their defense industry. And that puts us in direct competition, often for our own strategic objectives, because security force assistance is so inextricably linked to our own. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, I guess sort of 2 comments on that. One related to your question about, it says the good ever outweigh the bad, right? Isn't the joke about a friend World War II rifle when we dropped twice, right? And that was 1942, right? So I think, overcoming the sort of thoughts that we in the U.S. might have about France is hard. From a defense perspective, it's a tricky thing for the U.S. to navigate, right? So U.S. weapons tend to win out in competitions against French, German, and European, with some exceptions. The French were upset about the AUKUS deal because they lost their diesel submarine sales to Australia.
After they thought they had a commitment.
Yeah, after they had a scientific commitment. Yeah, so, Australia was seen as going back on its promise to France. France lost a lot of money, and it seems like a lot of France's concern is actually monetary, right, rather than sort of alliance or reputation. So I think there are sort of two tiers of arms producers. The U.S., maybe the Soviet Union, more skeptical about Russia being in this top tier, are able to produce their own weapons and don't necessarily depend on defense exports in the way that some of these smaller countries do. So France, Germany, Italy, UK make weapons, often very good weapons, but they depend on these foreign exports. And so there is intra-alliance competition, but what I think often wins out is the broader political and friendship ties that you get when you buy a U.S. weapon. Cyrus Vance, who was actual Secretary of Defense, Assistant Secretary of Defense, said in the 80s that, when you buy U.S., you're buying a long-term friendship and relationship. And so I think the French just can't compete with that on that broader political scale, which means that they often end up selling to other states like India, sometimes Brazil. France had signed a deal with India in 2015 to sell fighter jets, and India reneged on that deal. It seems like France has to sort of target a much wider array of states to sell arms to.
Considering that we constantly compare the Taiwan, China, relationship to Ukraine and Russia, I think that's like a really bad oversimplification and needs to be formally addressed.
Yes.
Especially considering Taiwan tries to say hey, US being that, no, it's totally different. You think that needs to be addressed on the international?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because if you look at even just the geography, it's wildly different, right? Taiwan is an island, it's right next to China. Ukraine is not an island, it's right, against the NATO allies. And one of the interesting things is that despite those differences, which are real and significant and matter, the sort of narrative among the allies is what happens in Ukraine matters for Taiwan, right? And so it's really hard to sort of rational out of that type of discussion. People try, right? Taiwan is probably part of China, right? There's sort of historical ties there. It would be really hard to send the U.S. Navy, right, to try and prevent China from invading Taiwan. Taiwan is not a formal U.S. ally, nor is Ukraine, like they're too tied into Europe. And so even though there are rational reasons to treat them as very separate, extremely distinct, it's really hard to unmove them. We have to sort of convince Taiwanese leaders, U.S. leaders, Ukrainian leaders, right? These are separate scenarios. That's just a really hard sell. I think if anyone can figure out how to do that, they would very, very, very quickly become very, very, very important in diplomatic processes, which is really hard. Really hard.
You said that junior powers have and coerce and major power. How generalized do you think you can make a statement over countries, for example, any country from the northern triangle? I think there's a lot that comes into play within comparing countries. And we compare Taiwan with most of the countries in South America.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So, and I should have mentioned this, one of the prerequisites of being able to do this type of coercion is that you have to actually have a sort of decent ally yourself, right? So a U.S. ally that sort of misbehaved on its own would have a much harder time claiming that it was being mistreated, right? Because the U.S. could say, hey, you just, open relations with China. And so during the Cold War, Pakistan tried to do this, what Taiwan did, and the U.S. said, are you kidding? You signed treaties with China when we were explicitly telling you not to. You can't kind of abandon it because you did that. So there is a sort of baseline level of performing the alliance that the junior power has to do in order to be able to do this. If junior powers can't play these reputational concerns, they can try to play alignment concerns, right? It's just say, well, okay, U.S., if you're not going to give me what I want, I'm going to ask Russia, right? Or I'm going to ask China, or I'm going to go rogue. right? And sort of do my own thing and cause problems for me that you're not going to want. They can try to do that, right? And then the U.S. has to sort of determine, can the state do what they're threatening to do? Do I care if they ally with Russia or China or whatever? So it can happen, but it's a little harder.
Thanks. So, I mean, first of all, I'm super impressed with the Connect here. I think this is the most Connect questions I've seen in a guest lecture. So,
Good question.
for all of you, thank you. I wanted to return to first of all, I asked a question about intra-alliance competition. My question is about whether do you think that the reputational costs are different when the full context of the junior partner relationship is in the context of NATO, for example. So, like, does the U.S. actually have more leverage over a partner like Turkey because the reputational assessment is occurring in a formal multilateral environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm hesitant to say yes, just because, especially Turkey has sort of been a thorn in NATO's side for a while. I mean, even just looking at Turkey's quest for an air defense system, in 2012, Turkey said, it just announced to NATO, we're buying air defense systems from China. That China had never exported before, and it wasn't clear that they were. Right? But Turkey just said, we're doing this. And so maybe one example of U.S. leverage over Turkey is that it didn't. Right? It didn't go through with that Chinese deal, which I think was signed in 2013 and Turkey reneged in 2015. But then Turkey did it anyway with Russia. Right? So I think with formal alliances, there's a little more leverage for the major power to say, you don't fully behave, we're going to take you out, you're going to sort of lose the association, the prestige, the mutual defense pact. But I think NATO might be the only sort of solid example of that. Even within NATO, you see intra-alliance fighting. So not just Turkey, except for Turkey, right? So Turkey misbehaving with the air defense systems, Turkey fighting with Greece about who owns what, where, when. So even within sort of these highly formalized, ideologically similar alliances, there's still a lot of sort of infighting.
Yeah, I'm having trouble thinking for myself now whether I would consider this an example of the U.S. having more leverage because we're able to say things like, okay, no F-35 is for you,
right.
Or whether it's still Turkey having leverage because they're not really. There aren't other major consequences, right? They're still in the alliance.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's a good question. I mean, when Turkey was first talking to Russia about the S-400, one of the things that it said was, well, we're doing this because the United States won't give us Patriot missile systems and we're worried about the war in Syria. It seemed like kind of a stretch for Turkey to make, but sort of still an example of Turkey trying to make these claims that you're not treating us well. And then when that didn't work, Turkey said, well, we're going to Russia because Russia is going to give us technology transfer. And basically help Turkey learn how to build these systems on its own. And the US said, hell no, we don't trust you. So Turkey has tried to sort of exercise this leverage with the US. It's been a little less successful, in the sense that it wasn't able to get Patriot missile systems from the US, it wasn't able to get technology transfer. But even when Turkey went and bought the S-400, it still never did. Like the US didn't kick it out. It's like, crap. All right, we have this ally who's being really problematic, and yet, right, we're going to keep them in the alliance. So maybe that does point to Turkey having some sort of leverage over the US, right? And breaking the alliance is like something I'm thinking.
Jim, what I'm sort of interested in, like, how broadly true to great powers that are not the United States is this consideration, both in terms of from a regime perspective, like is this more true of great powers that are democracies versus autocracies, and then historically, is this something that's held true, prior to the time frame of both World War II and International Order? Because I can imagine that the United States is kind of a unique case because it has the responsibility to maintain the status because they want to be disruptive in the international.
No, that's a good question. So I think for rising powers, it depends, it depends on the global time, actually. So I think post-Cold War, a rising power has to care about its reputation because the U.S. is always there as an option, or sort of banding together with other smaller powers as an option. So I think a good example of junior power leverage in practice is actually China's Belt and Road Initiative, right? So China, rising power, right, trying to do all sorts of things, and attract allies and friends, right? So not necessarily sign formal defense treaties with all these countries, but have friends. And if China fails to deliver on some of its BRI promises, that's then going to cause all of the other existing and potential BRI members to say, oh, do we want China? So one of the things that China is trying to do, sort of very deliberately and strategically, is show that it can be a good technology partner for cellular infrastructure. And so China is working to build 5G towers in Serbia and in Italy as well. So the UK is able to quash China's entrance to the UK. But, you know, China can sort of show, look, we're a good, benevolent partner, we build good tech, we're cheaper than the US, and we don't come with conditions attached to our aid. That would be a sort of significant statement from a rising power, right, that, you know, we recognize our reputation is important. And I think the way that China's trying to follow through on its BRI projects sort of shows that it cares what others think. What'll be interesting is what happens in some of China's projects in East Africa. There have been a lot of allegations of human rights abuses, and sort of things being done not well in terms of building roads, building bridges. But if China's able to sort of manage those concerns, I think this will, you know, really boost its reputation for the announcement of China's here in the world stage.
How would a state like North Korea, who is a small state in adaptation, would they be able to engage in this with China or not really?
My sort of gut instinct is not really, because North Korea doesn't seem to really care. That, you know, the autocracy, the continuation of the thin line seems to be a paramount concern, and so as long as that's not threatened, they don't really care. I mean, we don't have a ton of information about what happens within North Korea, but there are reports every few months of famine, right, of people being sort of horribly abused and mistreated in North Korea. And that doesn't seem to matter for them. So I actually think that China is a little wary of being seen as too friendly with North Korea, right? Sort of China's, you know, reputation as a major power. But North Korea is a liability in many senses. Which might mean to Keith's point about sort of regime type, right, might matter. Not that China's a democracy, right, but North Korea, I don't think cares much about its reputation.
If I ever just jump on that,
Yeah.
Fair amount of time recently, and that I was able to observe, at least from a perspective, our view of the geopolitical dynamics. I think it's fair to characterize the relationship between China and the DPRK as they're blade running at 51% to 49% of the market. They're always that 1% of this is what's acceptable, and that from Chinese perspective, because of how the good outweighs the bad, and you know, that can change instantaneously. When it does, you know, the Chinese may do something about it, but it is very, very slightly, just from a cost-benefit analysis, only slightly marginally acceptable from the Chinese perspective. And how well the Kim Jong-un and his regime senses that and demonstrates self-awareness and moderates the behavior accordingly. I think they're a little more savvy within that relationship than they're actually given credit. They are always laboring. It's fascinating. But yeah, it's like pick your worst, most irritating, frustrating, friendly, and whatever forms that dynamic with the now project that to the whole China DPRK.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And from a sort of connected to the reputational thing, you know, the North Korean nuclear talks, it's been a P5+1, right, to win those things. So China has a significant role as a permanent member of the UN Security Security Council, and it's often looked to as China really wanted to sort of rein in or block North Korea. So it is in some ways an opportunity for China to demonstrate, responsibility and like good state behavior. But North Korea does know just how to run up to that line, only very occasionally put its toe over it.
Do you think like new powers gain less agency than there's sort of this
It's a good question. And I think it depends on the type of conflict. So one of the things that we know about at least lower level conflict in the modern era is that coalition warfare seems to be really important for building legitimacy, for cost sharing, and burden sharing. And there, junior partners have a sort of dual role to play. On the one hand, the junior partners say, I won't build a coalition, which can delegitimize and perhaps result in questions about what the major power is doing. On the other hand, if the junior partner joins the coalition, it is then sort of subjected to, okay, here's what we're doing, right? And the power dictates that. So they do have a sort of dual role to play, right? Once they join, sort of with the major power, but they can always say no. In other conflicts, it's not a sort of coalition warfare where the alliance is doing something. One of the risks of sending arms is that the junior power can always use them, right? However they want, wherever they want. So the U.S. found this with Pakistan in the 1960s. Gave Pakistan tanks, planes, said, please don't use them against India. And what did Pakistan do? Didn't use them against India, right? More than once. So in that sense, junior partners can kind of just say, hey, I want to go fight India, right? I'm going to do it. You can't tell me not to. The major power can impose costs after that, right? So the U.S. embargoed Pakistan and said, we're done with you, right? But it didn't stop Pakistan from doing it anyway. So they can always find ways to try and do what they want to do. Yeah.
So going back to Berkeley, they arguably, and we've had contributors in the MWI website comments, they seem to have gained a disproportionate effect within their own geopolitical relations, vis-a-vis kind of a market they created that they can do. I mean, there was that space between commercial off the shelf, sort of drone saturation and the high-end systems that we sell.
Yeah.
And they almost defined that market for themselves, and they've exploited it to great, again, disproportionate effect. Does that represent, again, the broader market dynamics that we're talking about? Is that a new factor, or is that something that we saw differently?
It's interesting. So I think that it's an example of sort of smaller powers finding holes and clogging exploiting them. So I think the reason that Australia went to France for the diesel electric submarines is the US doesn't make them, right? If the US did, I can imagine Australia would have started with the US. So same thing with Turkey, right? Because we have restrictions on the types of drones that we are willing to send and the technology to share, Turkey can sort of overcome that on its own. I think that's a pretty niche market goal for its fulfill. Did we see that during the Cold War? Sort of. So the non-aligned movement tried to share weapons among themselves to make it possible to not be subjected to the US or the Soviet Union. They weren't nearly as technologically advanced as either, so there was a sort of upper limit on the types of weapons that they were able to make. But Egypt and Yugoslavia did try to carve out space separate from either major power. It was moderately successful. I think that's probably the case.
How much do you see the dynamic hold when the junior partner is a government that was stood up as a Afghan government?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the thing about the Cold War and Chile, the Pinochet regime, right? There had been a democratically elected socialist government. The US was involved in sort of overthrowing that democratically elected government. In comes military junta and just horrible things, right? Multiple disappearances, extrajudicial killings, still deserve a lot of reckoning with what happened in Brazil. The US sort of knew for the most part what was going on. And so I think the government was allowed or able to get away with a lot of stuff the US sort of was saying was unacceptable elsewhere. And that really was a government that sort of helped pop up. With Afghanistan, it's a good question. I mean, I think that having a sort of relationship with the United States does let you get away with things you might not have been able to otherwise. And the US doesn't generally tend to criticize its allies, at least publicly and outright. But there is a line that allies are not supposed to cross. Those are seen as a bad and responsible states. So, and I think that would be sort of effective in that situation.
So, this is a little bit of a different flavor of the discussion, but going back to the regional thing, penetrating the regional security conflict. What does our seemingly ability to have snatched victory from the jaws of the food has been solid? What does that signal within sort of this broader market discussion, and then as well as the not just the geopolitics, but the geoeconomics and really kind of this enduring soft power competition we have at the time and the competing things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of big question is what's going to happen with the South China Sea, and as China keeps island building and the US keeps going to be doing navigation controls, at what point are those things going to become inevitably colliding? Soft power wise, it's actually just listening to an NPR who's on soft power in South Korea. So my take is not an economist, and sort of not a cultural expert. Would be that South Korea is winning the soft power battle more so than China. They, you think about South Korean boy bands, right? Movies, TV shows, Squid Game, and so on. That's making much more bigger impact in the US than anything in China. So I think from soft power perspective, which is the ways we're trying to go to have sort of influence and standing in the US and the way that some other places do. But that the island building and relations with China and Vietnam are sort of a really important thing there.
So I think the argument that to be made against that is that there's not a lot of overt with Chinese, but like more so like covert, like the Wolf Warrior type way, the influence in Hollywood, making sure that like the bad guy in all the movies that we watch is never Chinese, or like influence in Silicon Valley, like stealing intellectual value, or influence on Wall Street, making sure that investments are in the mainland China, and the money never gets withdrawn from China. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And the Hollywood villain not being Chinese is a really good one, right? Because some of these other examples of being where you're stealing intellectual property, right, or hacking in and taking information is less of a soft power, more of just a doing things covertly and trying not to get attention, right? So I think the good soft power example would be the Hollywood one, right? That villains aren't made Chinese and that different versions of movies are released in China. Right? And the fact that China has been able to make the major Hollywood movie companies edit and change their movies to sell in China is huge, right? That's like a significant statement of power, which I think is just fascinating.
How much, with respect to intellectual property, and how that ostensibly artificially props up China's domestic defense industry, plus their lack of operational testing, plus their unproven systems integration, how much is that?
It's huge. So there
and are they self-aware?
The self-aware question is a good one. I don't know. I imagine they have to be partly self-aware, just because it would baffle me if they're not. There are two Italian scholars, Moro and Andrea, who have actually a lot about why China will never have a good domestically produced drone. And that's despite sort of stealing plans, capturing, down drones, that it's not just the intellectual property that matters, it's the sort of scale of operational know-how, the experience. And so for that reason, sure, take all the plans, right, from US weapons, it's never going to result in the same thing. I think China was starting to realize that with some of its attempts to make stealth fighter jets, that it wasn't just the plans, but it was a sort of whole background and institutional knowledge. But they're still trying, right? So there must be some sort of belief that can be overcome. But I think the enterprise has been not nearly as easy as China expected it to be.
At what point did it revert back on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I know that they tried to reverse engineer some old Russian systems. I don't know, just from what the Gilly brothers have said, and I take them as a fairly good source on this, that it's just very unlikely in terms of these sort of very technologically and sophisticated firearms type weapons.
Considering that China has retaken Taiwan mentioned the Constitution by 2029, what are your predictions for the other China to retake Taiwan, and what do you think that is?
That's a great question. I don't know if China will actually retake Taiwan. I think a lot of it is going to depend on how states react to what happens in Russia, or in Ukraine, excuse me, especially after Putin announced these territories are Russian. Right, so Putin said that Donbass was Russian, Donetsk and Luhansk are Russian, just as he did with Crimea, right? They were revoked and then they're now Russian. And Putin followed that up by saying, any encroachment on Russian territory will be taken as an existential threat and any abuse, right? And so I think what the world is trying to grapple with now is how far can we push the territorial conquest envelope without having a response, right? Without being met by a military response. If these regions in Ukraine are sort of easily claimed by Russia and taken by Putin, you can imagine China thinking, okay, well maybe the same thing will happen if we try to claim Taiwan. Especially because there are much deeper historical ties between China and Taiwan. If Putin gets pushback on this claiming of these Ukrainian territories, then I think China might be a little more cautious. I think the bottom line is that China can do it whenever it wants. It's just a question of what are going to be the economic consequences, what are going to be the military consequences, and will the U.S. help Taiwan prepare, if not to win, to at least impose significant costs on China by giving them sort of air defense weaponry, right, sort of arms that can repel ships trying to access Taiwan. So one of the things that we try to avoid as political scientists is giving predictions, because we're pretty much always wrong. But I think that looking at what factors would enable China to make a more likely claim against Taiwan is one of the most things about that. And I do think that a lot of what happens in Ukraine is going to matter there. Which I know is not a satisfactory answer, but.
So that's assuming that the people who are making it to high level and are also not immune to that linkage that you're saying.
Yeah, I think they are sort of believing that, right? That things are linked, that we should infer how a state will act here based on what the state does here.
You go back to your honor and interest, right? What are the Chinese speaking with respect to just a list of them. If you had a quad becoming a formal security alliance, if you're the Japanese and a regional arms competition, Japan has the 6th largest military in the world, which is a pretty remarkable achievement considering constitutionally they're not and there's sort of there's lived historical memory that sort of informs some concern about that relationship. And so today I don't dispute Jerry's that assessment personally that they can do whatever they want. It does become a significant, just like with really anything, arguably a cost benefit analysis. The operational cost today would be severe. It is a difficult operational problem set that arguably there's parity right now between capability in context between the Taiwanese and the Chinese, and it wouldn't be clean and easy. But then you look at the real lesson with the predicate that the West is able to maintain unity and response against the Russians and the support for the Ukrainians. Now the Chinese just don't look at it like, think of all the opportunity costs they get immediately invited. The Quad does become a formal alliance. Japan is going to be unconstrained now as far as how they're arming. And, you know, we're going to start seriously looking at the utility of land power everywhere within the region and try to formalize some security arrangements therein. They're not going to want to invite that. The only way you do invite that to the Chinese is through some type of aggressive military action, which, oh, by the way, is illegal by international law anyway. It's not necessarily a constraint, but it's from a reputational perspective, it doesn't matter. But what's the real Chinese takeaway? Arguably, going back to what you saying about the wolf warrior and all of our misinterpretations of Sun Tzu, can they, between now and 2049, exert so much pressure that the Taiwanese are just going to accede to whatever? And can that pressure be non-military? Absolutely. And that's, if we're going to get into the predictive space, then I think that's the reasonable predicament.
Yeah, I think looking at the sort of factors that are most likely to make China think that this is the opportune time, right? It's a good way to think about it. So if China senses that the Quad is going to formalize a mutual defense treaty, right? That weighs on the do it now because it's more costly later. If China thinks that Taiwan is slipping in its military preparations, that means better to do it now than later. So it's not only a cost benefit or what would it take right at this moment in time to try and take Taiwan, but are those costs growing in the future? And if the Quad becomes formalized, if Australia does get these nuclear submarines, if Taiwan doesn't get the arms that it says it needs to do sort of sea defense, then that weighs on the do it now rather than put it off till later when we might be facing more formalized, better prepared scenarios.
I think that's why we're holding off on providing the nuclear submarines.
Well, Australia has to do a ton of work to be ready to accept the nuclear submarines. So it has to basically start up the civilian nuclear energy industry to be able to service the submarines, deal with the enriched uranium, the nuclear reactor cores. So that's going to take a really long time. And then that's, never mind the training that Australia's Navy has to undergo to operate, to safely use these things. So one of the estimates that I saw was 10 years minimum for that to sort of happen to a satisfactory level for Australia to be able to independently operate these. So I think that that's going to be something that China watches very closely. What's happening with it on. Any last questions? Strongly disagree with.
Ben, you're getting it.
Yeah.
I guess it's just a question, probably.
Yeah.
Are you sort of think it was infrastructure work. I don't want anyone to be trying to be.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's about access and infrastructure. Infrastructure is really hard to change once it's built. And so this was sort of one of the issues with the UK saying they were not allowed Chinese companies to build 5G towers and wiring and infrastructure. Once that stuff's built, it's a lot harder to take it down and replace it with something new. Where you tend to go back to the sort of original manufacturer for repair, updates, and kind of things. So I think the goal is if China can be the one building this infrastructure and sort of getting in at the ground floor, it's setting itself up for decades of being the go-to country to repair these things. It's also a status thing, very much. That the U.S. is the superpower, has military bases all over the world. So what does a state do if it wants to become superpower? Make military bases all over the world. Sort of why there's this phenomenon of landlocked countries having as part of the Navy. It makes no sense. why does a landlocked country have a Department of the Navy? Because a modern state has a Department of the Navy, right, Department of the Navy. So it's this sort of mimicking status or projecting things. So I think it's that combination of infrastructure and sort of status.
Well, thank you very much for your
And thank you all for
insightful